The bailiff laughs at the boy, who asks for 48 hours to save his ruined home. Then the boy names a single figure, 30 riangs, in 2 days. The bailiff earns 8 a month, and the laughter stops. Now imagine how it all began. He opens his eyes and doesn't recognize the ceiling. Wooden beams, dampness, the smell of mold and sourness, a body that isn't his own, thin, pale hands, fingers trembling, a buzzing in his head as if after a blow. He struggles to sit up and nearly falls. His legs won't hold him. A man is shouting behind the wall, words that are unfamiliar yet somehow understandable. The bailiff reads the inventory: a dark wood cabinet, 2 chairs, a desk, 3 ledgers, a copper mirror. He turns his head and catches his reflection. A boy of about 14 is looking back at him. A thin face, dark circles under his eyes, chapped lips. It isn't him. The last thing he remembers is the headlights of an oncoming car and the cold river water. He fell asleep at the wheel after a night shift. 34 years old, senior analyst in the risk department, specialist in commodity derivatives, and now a 14-year-old body in a room with broken shutters. The bailiff bursts through the door. He's fat, red-faced, a list in his hand. He jabs his finger at the boy and tells him he has an hour to pack. The assets of the Sow house go towards settling the debt to the Park house, 12,000 gold riangs. The boy on the floor is So Taewan, the sole heir to a trading house with a 200-year history. His father died of a stroke 5 days ago. His mother left a year earlier. Taewan sits amid scattered books and counts, 12,000 riang. A dock worker earns 2 riang a month. That's 6,000 man-years of debt. His body is weak and hungry. His name is respectable but empty. No connections, no capital. And then he picks up one of the books. He opens it at random and freezes. Columns of grain prices in 3 cities over 3 years. In Cheongju, a sack of wheat is 7 silver won. In Myeongjin, 22. In Seho, 14. A 3-fold difference between the 2 ports, and no one transports it. He flips through the pages. Salt, same thing. Iron, even worse. This world doesn't know the word arbitrage, doesn't know the word futures, doesn't know what diversification is. The entire economy of the continent lies before him like an open book, and in 200 years, no one has thought to read it. The bailiff yells again from the hallway. Taewan closes the book. He stands up. He dusts off his knees and speaks in a new voice, quietly and calmly. Give me 48 hours. He'll offer the House of Pak a deal they won't refuse. The bailiff roars with laughter. He asks if the boy has been struck dumb with grief. Taewan doesn't argue. He simply names the amount, 10% of the first voyage, in cash. The bailiff chokes with laughter. 10% of what? Taewan replies that it's 10% of 300 riangs in net profit, 30 riangs for 2 days of waiting. The bailiff earns 8 riangs a month. He is silent for about 10 seconds. Then he mutters that 48 hours is 2 days, and if the boy brings nothing but nonsense, the inventory will continue. Taewan nods and leaves. Outside, the air stings with salt and rotting seaweed. The port city of Myeongjin, a gray sky, seagulls, wet dock planks. He walks toward the port, not toward the moneylenders, not toward family he doesn't have, toward the port, because a ship is moored there. The only asset that is still, at least formally, his father's ship. Seized for a debt of 800 riangs, but not yet transferred. At the 7th pier he finds what he was looking for, an old merchant ship with peeling paint. The name is barely legible, Morning Heron. The deck is empty. Taewan climbs the gangplank. The planks creak under his light weight. A light is on in the cabin. He goes down. A woman is sitting at the table, about 30 years old, tall, a weathered face, a scar across her eyebrow. In front of her is a bottle of rice wine and an empty cup. This is Captain Han Riel, a former lieutenant in the Royal Navy, exiled for refusing to sink a ship carrying refugees. She lost her crew 5 years ago. Since then, she's been drinking and waiting for the ship to be repossessed for her debts. She looks up at the boy in the doorway, asks what he wants. Taewan sits down across from her. He pulls a scroll from his bosom. He places it on the table. A warehouse receipt, written in his own hand, certified by 2 witnesses from the market whom he intercepted along the way. The paper states that So Taewan acknowledges Captain Han as the owner of 1/3 of the ship Morning Heron, in exchange for the immediate transport of salt from Cheongju to Myeongjin. Han looks at the document, then at the boy. He dismisses it as nonsense. The ship is impounded. Taewan smiles. He says the ship is impounded for a debt of 800 riang. A single salt voyage from Cheongju to Myeongjin nets about 300. In Cheongju, due to a poor harvest, salt is 7 won per sack. In Myeongjin, due to the blockade, it's 22. The Heron's hold can take 2,000 sacks. 3 trips in a month and a half, and they'll buy the ship from the park house at their own valuation, at a profit. He's already made a deal with the bailiff. The seizure is lifted for 10% of the first voyage. The contract is in the bag. All she has to do is agree to become a co-owner. Or she can keep drinking at the dock and watch as her dead friend's ship goes to the very people who sank it. Han Riel is silent for a full minute. Then she quietly asks how old he is. 14. She says he isn't So Tavan. He replies that he is So Tavan, just a little different. She looks at him for a long time. Then she takes a brush and signs her name. That night, Taiwan sleeps on the deck of the Morning Heron, wrapped in a stranger's cloak. Stars hang over the harbor. For the first time in 5 days in this foreign body, he doesn't feel the cold, because the So family name has an asset again. An old ship with peeling paint, a drinking captain with a scar, and a boy with a head full of formulas from another world. That's enough for a start. The Morning Heron left the port of Myeongjin at dawn on the 3rd of the day. Han Riel stood at the helm and said nothing. There was no crew, just 3 sailors she'd found overnight in the harbor taverns. An old man named Mal who coughed every 3 words, a guy in his 20s named Taeho with a broken nose and a crooked grin, and a middle-aged woman named Bokcha who used to mend nets, but now would agree to anything just to avoid sleeping on the street. Taevan stood at the stern and watched as Myeongjin grew smaller in the distance. He was counting in his head. 2 days to Cheongju with a tailwind, 3 against the wind. A day to load the salt, 2 days back. A total of 1 week per trip, if he's lucky with the wind. If not, 10 days. He went down into the hold and inspected it. It was empty and damp. The planks were rotten in places. 2,000 sacks was an optimistic estimate. Realistically, this hold could hold 1,800. He did the math. With 1,800 sacks and a difference of 17 won per sack, the net profit from the voyage would be 27,000 won. Minus expenses for the crew and port fees, minus 10% to the shipmaster from the first voyage, net profit of about 240 riang, not 300 as he had told Khan, but enough. 3 voyages and the debt for the ship is paid off. He went up on deck. Han looked at him and asked how much it really was. Taewan replied that it was 240. She nodded. She said she knew he'd overestimated it, but she signed it anyway, because 240 is still more than 0. The journey to Cheongju took 2.5 days. The wind was fickle. Mal coughed and cursed at the rigging. Taeho turned out to be quite capable. He climbed the masts like a monkey and knew every knot. Bokcha cooked rice on a small brazier on deck and asked no questions. Taiwan sat in the cabin and read his father's books. 3 notebooks filled with records, prices, routes, suppliers' names, contacts in every port. Father So Ingyu was a good merchant. He kept his records neatly and in detail, but he thought like an old-world merchant. Buy cheap, sell high, keep money in a chest. Taiwan thought differently. Money in a chest is dead money. Money must work, move, turn into goods, goods into a receipt into credit, credit into new goods, a cycle, turnover. Turnover speed is what matters, not the size of the capital. They arrived in Cheongju by evening on the 5th day. A small port on the shore of the bay. It smelled of fish and smoke. Taiwan went ashore and headed to the market, alone. Han wanted to go with him, but he said that a 14-year-old boy with an account book arouses curiosity, and a 14-year-old boy with an armed woman arouses suspicion. She stayed on the ship. At the Cheongju market, Taiwan found what he was looking for in 20 minutes. 3 salt warehouses. 2 belonged to small merchants. 1 to a major supplier named Quan De Sik. Taiwan went to the small ones. The first merchant asked for 9 won per sack. That was higher than the market price of 7. Taiwan didn't haggle. He went to the second one. The second asked for 8. Taiwan offered him 7.5 for the entire shipment, 400 sacks, payment upon loading, cash. The merchant agreed. Cash was king in this world. Taiwan pulled a small pouch of silver from his pocket, 30 riang, all he had. It was money he'd found in a secret compartment in his father's desk, a small drawer with a false bottom. His mother had apparently stashed it away for a rainy day. That rainy day had come. He paid for 400 sacks of salt and arranged for loading the next morning. Then he went to see Quan Dasik, a major merchant, a fat man with shifty eyes and gold rings on every finger. Taiwan offered him a deal. 1,400 sacks of salt at 7 won per sack. Payment not in cash. Payment by a warehouse receipt from the So trading house. Kwon laughed. He asked what So trading house he was talking about. That house went under 5 years ago. Taewon placed the paper in front of him. The receipt promised payment 30 days after the salt was delivered to Myeongjin. A guarantee. The ship, Morning Heron, valued at 800 ryong. Kwon stopped laughing. 800 ryong for 9,800 won worth of goods. The collateral was the transaction amount. He asked where the boy had gotten the ship. Taewon replied that it was an inheritance, and that in 30 days he would return with the money, or Kwon would get the ship. Kwon thought for 5 minutes. Then he said he wanted 15% on top. Taewon agreed to 12. Kwon agreed to 12. They shook hands. The next morning, 1,800 sacks of salt were loaded into the hold of the Morning Heron. 400 paid in cash, 1,400 on credit, secured by the ship. Han stood on the deck and looked at the loaded hold. She said the boy had just put the ship on the line. If anything went wrong, they would lose everything. Taewon replied that if he were afraid of losing everything, he wouldn't have fallen asleep at the wheel on the overpass. Khan didn't get it. He said it was a joke. She didn't smile. The return trip took 3 days. The wind was blowing from astern. The Heron moved slowly under a full load, but sailed smoothly. Taewon did the math. 1,800 bags at 22 won each in Myeongjin. Revenue, 39,600 won, minus expenses. Profit, about 250 ryang, better than he'd thought. They entered the port of Myeongjin at sunset on the 9th day. Berth number 7. Taewon went ashore and set out to sell the salt. He sold it all in 2 days, not through the market, directly to the port kitchens and salting workshops. 20 won per sack, slightly below market price, but faster. Turnover is more important than price per unit. That's a rule no one here knew. 11 days after leaving Myeongjin, So Taewon was holding 230 ryang in net profit. He gave 30 to the harbor master. He sent a messenger to Cheongju with money for Kwon Dae-sik, and he looked at Han Riel. The first voyage, one of 3. She nodded. For the first time during the entire voyage, something resembling a smile flashed across her face. Taewon and Han Riel had completed their first trading voyage from Cheongju to Myeongjin. Taewon bought 1,800 sacks of salt using cash and a loan secured against the ship. The voyage yielded 230 ryang in net profit. The ship's officer was paid his share, and the money was sent to the creditor, Kwon. 2 more voyages lay ahead before the ship was paid off. The second voyage began 4 days later. Taewon did not spend those days resting. He walked around Myeongjin and memorized everything. The prices at every stall, the merchants' names, who owed whom, who was feuding with whom, who drank, who gambled, who beat his wife, who takes bribes. Information in this world was worth more than gold because no one thought to gather it. He wrote everything down in a small notebook he carried tucked under his arm. On the second day, he found something interesting. There was a tavern in the port district. The landlady served rice with fish and diluted wine. A girl worked behind the counter, a redhead with freckles and a hoarse voice, 16 years old. She hauled heavy trays and snapped at drunken sailors. Taewon sat down at a corner table and ordered tea. The girl brought the tea and nearly spilled it. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion. Taewon asked her name. Son Ada. The surname struck a chord. Sun. The treasurer of House So had borne the surname Sun for 20 years. He asked if she was Son Yeon-ho's daughter. The girl froze. She looked at him as if he'd struck her. Then she said yes, and that her father was dead, and that she had nothing to say about it. Taewon nodded. He finished his tea. He left a coin 3 times the usual amount, and left. But he returned that evening. He sat down at the same table. He pulled one of his father's ledgers from his coat. He opened it to a page where the columns didn't match up. A difference of 42 for the quarter. Small change, but systematic. Someone had been siphoning money from the House of So, bit by bit, for years. Son Ada, passing by, glanced at the book. She stopped, looked at the page, and quietly said there was a mistake in the 3rd line. The multiplier is wrong. It should be 17, but it says 12. Taewon looked. She was right. He'd checked that page twice and hadn't noticed, but she'd spotted it on the fly, over his shoulder. He asked how she knew. She replied that her father had taught her to count from the age of 6. He wanted her to take his place. and then everything came crashing down. Tevan closed the book. He said he needed an accountant. She laughed. She said he was a boy, and boys don't have accountants. He replied that this boy had a ship and 230 riangs in cash. She stopped laughing. He said the salary was 4 riangs a month, twice what she earned at the tavern, plus a share of the profits from every voyage, plus a job her father would consider worthy. Ara was silent for a long time. Then she asked why he needed this. Tevan replied that he needed someone who could spot the mistake in the third line. There might be 5 such people on this continent, and one of them was serving rice to drunken sailors. The next morning, son Ara arrived at Pier Number 7 with a small bundle of belongings and her younger sister in her arms. Her sister was 8 years old. Her name was Sun Miri. Taiwan looked at both of them. Then he looked at Han Riel. Han shrugged. She said there was a vacant cabin on the ship. Miri immediately ran off to explore the deck. Ara sat down at the desk in Taiwan's cabin and opened the ledgers. By evening, she had found 7 more errors. The second voyage to Cheongju went more smoothly. Tevan already knew the route. He knew the suppliers. He knew how much to pay and to whom. Kwon-taesik in Cheongju greeted him like an old friend. The debt for the first voyage was paid on time. This made an impression. Kwon said that in 30 years of trading, the boy was the first to pay on time. Taiwan offered him a new deal. The same 1,400 sacks, but not secured by the ship, secured by a warehouse receipt. A piece of paper guaranteeing payment from the profits of a specific voyage. Kwon turned the paper over in his hands. He said it was just a promise on paper. Taiwan replied that gold was just metal too. People are the ones who assign value to things. He had paid on time the first time. He would pay the second time as well. And a warehouse receipt was more convenient than collateral because the ship didn't need to be reappraised every time. Kwon agreed. Reluctantly, but he agreed. It was a moment. Small and inconspicuous, but Taiwan knew its value. The first warehouse receipt in Haegyeon's history accepted as a means of payment. Not gold, not silver. A signed piece of paper. If this principle works for Kwon, it will work for 10 merchants. For 100. For 1,000. The return trip brought in 260 riangs, more than the first. Tevan sold the salt faster. Ara kept the accounts. Every sack, every coin, every buyer. Tevan looked at her records and, for the first time in all these days, felt something resembling peace. He now had someone who could count better than he could. It was priceless. After the second voyage, he sat on the deck of the 3 herons at night. Ara had gone to put Miri to bed. Khan was in her cabin. Tevan looked at the harbor lights and thought, one more voyage, then the ship's redemption, then real work, warehouses, receipts, the bank, a network of couriers, everything this world hadn't seen yet. He took out his father's book. He opened the last page. There was a note he hadn't noticed before, in small handwriting at the very edge. The words were partially erased, but he made them out, the second shelf on the right, and his father's signature. Tevan closed the book. He looked into the darkness, the second shelf on the right, in the house that no longer existed, in the little office that the bailiffs had seized. Something had been hidden there, something worth remembering. He didn't know exactly what, but he remembered. Tevan found Sun Ara, the daughter of the former treasurer of the So House, and hired her as an accountant after she spotted an error in his father's books on the spot. The second shipment brought in 260 riangs and marked the first instance in which a warehouse receipt was accepted as a means of payment. Tevan discovered a mysterious note from his father regarding the second shelf on the right. The third voyage was the last before the ship's redemption. Tevan prepared for it differently. He didn't just count the sacks and prices. He was thinking 2 steps ahead. If, after the redemption of the Morning Heron, the House of Pak found out that the boy had paid them back with their own money over the course of 3 voyages, it would be a slap in the face. A public one. A resounding one. Houses do not forgive slaps in the face. That meant that after the buyout, a counter-offensive would begin. He needed to prepare for it. Before setting sail, Tevan did 3 things. First, he went to the bailiff and paid him the remaining share. 30 riangs for the first voyage, and another 20 on top of that. The bailiff was surprised. Tevan said it was an advance for future loyalty. If the House of Pak tried to seize the So family's property again, he wanted to know about it a day in advance. The bailiff looked at the money, then at the boy, then at the money again. He nodded. Second, Tevan found an old man named Pai Gonsu at the port. A former bailiff, a former customs official, 60 years old, fired 10 years ago for refusing to sign false declarations. Since then, he had been living in a port flophouse and writing petitions that no one read. Tevin offered him a job, administrative manager of the So trade union, a salary of 6 riang a month, 3 times more than he had earned in the civil service. Pai Gonsu asked which union. Tevin replied that it was the one he was planning to establish. The old man looked at the boy for a long time. Then he asked how old he was. Tevin replied that he was 14, but he could calculate faster than any 40-year-old merchant in this city. Bai Gonsu smirked. He said the boy was brazen. Tevin replied that brazenness was a resource when backed by numbers. The old man agreed. Third, Tevin went to ruins of his father's shop. The building stood on the corner of a street by the harbor, 2 blocks from the pier. 2 stories. The first floor was stone. The second floor was wooden. The roof had caved in one spot. The windows were boarded up. The doors were sealed. But the building wasn't on the inventory list. Taiwan checked. The shop didn't belong to the So family, but to Taiwan's mother personally. It was registered under her maiden name. The creditors hadn't touched it because they didn't know or didn't want to look into it. Tevin stood in front of this building and didn't see ruins. He saw a warehouse. The first floor was stone, dry, with thick walls, perfect for storing grain and salt. The second floor was an office, a place for records and accounts. The roof could be repaired for 20 riang, the doors replaced for 5. He made a note in his notebook. After the third voyage. The third voyage went off without a hitch. The wind was favorable. Quan Dasik shipped the salt in Cheongju without haggling. The receipt worked. The return trip took 2 days. Taiwan sold the salt in 3 days. The revenue was 270 riang, more than on previous occasions. He was learning, finding new buyers, cutting the price slightly below market value to sell faster. Turnover. The total net profit for the 3 trips was 730 riang. After deducting expenses for the crew and the bailiff's share, he was left with just over 600. Enough. He arrived at the park house office at noon on the 28th day since he had woken up in a stranger's body. The office stood on Myeongjin's main street, a stone building with columns, dark wood doors. Above the entrance, a coat of arms with 3 crossed keys. Tevin entered alone, without guards, in plain clothes, with a leather bag slung over his shoulder. He was met by a clerk. The clerk asked what he wanted. Tevin gave a name. So, Tevin, I've come to redeem the collateral. The clerk left and returned 10 minutes later. He led the boy into an office on the 2nd floor. Seated at the desk was a man Tevin was seeing for the first time, but recognized immediately. Park Jung-ho, 50 years old, a full face, kind eyes, a smile that never faded. For 20 years, he had been Taiwan's father's best friend, and the first to sign the papers that ruined him. Park Jung-ho looked at the boy and smiled. He said he was glad to see the son of an old friend. He asked how he was doing. Taiwan replied that he was fine and that he had come on business. He took a bag out of his bag with money. He placed it on the table. 800 riang, the estimated value of the ship Morning Heron. Full repayment of the loan. Park Jung-ho stopped smiling. Not entirely. The smile remained on his lips, but his eyes had changed. He asked where the boy had gotten such money. Taiwan replied that he had earned it, from 3 salt shipments from Cheongju. Park Jung-ho was silent. Then he said he was surprised, and that his father would be proud. Taiwan looked him in the eyes and said nothing. He knew that this man was speaking of the pride of a father whom he himself had destroyed. But showing anger now would be a mistake. Anger is a luxury. It costs too much. Park Jung-ho signed the document releasing the lien. The Morning Heron officially became the property of So Taiwan, entirely, unencumbered. Taiwan took the paper. He stood up. He bowed exactly as much as etiquette required, not a degree less, and he walked out. Han was waiting for him on the street. She stood leaning against the wall across from the office. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her face was stony. Taiwan approached and showed her the paper. She took it, read it, looked at him, and said one word, "Well done." It was the longest expression of approval he'd ever heard from her. They walked back to the pier. On the way, Tavon explained the plan to her. Now that the ship was free of the lien, it became a real asset, not just a transport, a collateral base for a loan. This ship could attract another 800 riangs in investments. Khan asked what for. Tavon replied that it was for a warehouse. His mother's shop needed to be rebuilt. It would be the first warehouse of the So Trade Union, a place where merchants could store goods and receive receipts for them, receipts that could be used to pay just like money. Han stopped. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was crazy. Tavon replied that in this world, the crazy ones change the rules, and normal people play by them. Tavon completed his third voyage with a total profit of 730 riangs over 3 voyages. He hired former bailiff Pei Gonsu as his manager. He bought the ship Morning Heron from the House of Pak, paying 800 riangs personally to Pak Jong-ho. He discovered that his mother's shop had not been included in the inventory and planned to turn it into the first warehouse of the new So Trading Union. Renovating the shop took 2 weeks. Tavon spent his money cautiously. 20 riangs for the roof, 5 for the doors and shutters, 10 for the interior finishing of the first floor. The stone walls were cleaned. The floor was leveled. Wooden shelves were placed along the walls, 3 rows, as tall as 2 people. Each shelf was numbered. Tavon drew the layout diagram himself. The second floor became the office, 2 desks, chairs, bookshelves, and a large board on the wall on which Tavon sketched routes and prices with charcoal. Hanriel looked at the board and said nothing. To her, they were just lines and numbers. To Tavon, it was a map of the future. Each line was a route, each number was an opportunity. Where the lines crossed was where a warehouse was needed. For now, there was only one intersection on the board, Myeongjin, but soon there would be others. Ara worked non-stop. She started new ledgers, a separate notebook for each product, a separate one for each supplier, a separate one for expenses. Tavon showed her the principle of double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction is recorded twice, receipts and expenditures, debits and credits. Ara mastered it in a day. By the second day, she had already found a way to make the tables more compact. Tavon watched her and thought that in his past world, she would have become a financial director by the age of 30. In this world, she was serving rice in a tavern. Injustice works the same way in any century. The warehouse opened in the 3rd week of the 2nd month, quietly, without ceremony. Tavon simply went to the market and spoke with 3 merchants. He offered to store their grain in his warehouse for free for the first month. In return, he asked for only one thing, to let him issue warehouse receipts for their goods, a document confirming that a certain number of sacks of grain belonging to a specific merchant were stored at So's warehouse. The merchants didn't understand why this was necessary. One asked what the paper was for if the grain was already in the warehouse. Tavon explained, "Imagine that a merchant from Myeongjin owes a merchant from Seho 100 riang for cloth. Normally, he would have to sell the grain, get the money, and send it to Seho. That takes 3 weeks. With the receipt, he simply hands over the paper. The merchant from Seho comes to So's warehouse and picks up the grain. Or he passes the receipt to a 3rd merchant. The grain stays put, only the papers change hands. Faster, cheaper, safer." One of the merchants said it was nonsense. Who would trust a piece of paper? Taewon replied that people would trust a piece of paper when it was backed by a reputation, and that he would build that reputation. 2 of the 3 merchants agreed. The 3rd left. That was normal. Taewon knew that not everyone accepts something new right away. 2 are enough. The first transaction is enough. If the receipt works once, it will work 10 times. If 10, then 100. The first receipts were simple. A sheet of paper, the House of So's seal, a description of the goods, quantity, date, Tavon's signature, the owner's signature. Otto recorded each receipt in a separate ledger. Number, date, goods, owner, status. Tevin knew that in 5 years, this book would become the foundation of the banking system for an entire continent. But for now, it was just a notebook. In the 4th week, what he had been waiting for happened, and what he had feared. A man came to the warehouse, short, unremarkable, gray clothes, a face you forget the moment you turn away. He asked for Tevin. Ara pointed upstairs to the office. The man went upstairs. Tevin was sitting at a desk, writing. The man entered and closed the door. He said he had come from the House of Pak, and that he had a proposal. The House of Pak was ready to buy the So warehouse for 500 riangs, right now, in cash. Tevin didn't look up. He asked what if not. The man said that then the park house would be forced to remind customs officials that certain shipments of salt from Cheongju had passed through without paying the full duty. That would mean a fine, seizure of the goods, possibly seizure of the ship. Taiwan raised his head. He looked at the man and laughed. The man hadn't expected that. Taiwan explained. On every voyage from Cheongju, he had paid the full duty. The receipts are kept in the ledgers maintained by ARA. They are certified with a customs seal. If the House of Park files a false accusation and Taiwan presents the receipts, then under the Myeongjin law, the accuser must pay a fine equal to double the amount of the alleged violation. In other words, the House of Park would have to pay Taiwan. He suggested that the man convey this to Park Chun-ho, and to add that so Taiwan always pays on time and always keeps his receipts. The man left. Taiwan sat motionless for another 10 minutes after he left. Then he stood up and went downstairs. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline. It was the first attack, a minor one, a test run. The park house was testing him, checking how he'd react. The next attack would be more serious. He found Han at the pier. He told her everything. She listened in silence. Then she said he needed security. Taiwan replied that he couldn't afford it yet. Han said it wasn't a question of money. It was a question of whether he'd live to see the next voyage. A kid who'd earned 700 ryongs in a month and snatched a ship right from under the Pak House's nose wasn't just a nuisance. He was a target. Taiwan knew she was right, but security cost money he didn't have. Or rather, he had it, but it was needed for something else. For the second warehouse. For expansion. For the next step. He stood on the pier and looked at the Morning Heron, at its peeling paint, at the old masts, at the patched sails. This ship was all he had, and the people. Han, Ada, Little Miri, Paigonsu, the sailors. They all depended on him now. Taiwan clenched his fists, closed his eyes, and began to count. Not money, risks, the probability of an attack, the probability of a false accusation, the probability that the House of Park would bribe the suppliers, the probability that Kwon Sik in Cheongju would back out of the deals under pressure. Every risk had a price. Every price had a solution. He just had to find it before they struck. Taiwan opened his first warehouse in Myeongjin and launched a warehouse receipt system, convincing 2 merchants to store grain and accept paper receipts instead of cash. The park house sent a messenger with a threat of a false customs accusation, but Taiwan fended off the attack by presenting the receipts. Han warned him that he needed security and that he was now a target for a serious attack. The solution came on the 5th day after the visit from the man from the House of Park. Taiwan hadn't slept for 3 nights. He'd been calculating, weighing his options. Security cost at least 50 ryangs a month for 4 men. He didn't have that kind of money on a regular basis. More accurately, he did, but every ryang was already allocated. The warehouse in Cheongju, expanding the team, the 4th and 5th voyages. Spending on security meant slowing down growth. Slowing down growth meant giving the House of Pak time to strike. A vicious circle. He decided to break it not with money, but with logic. On the morning of the 6th day, Taiwan went to the port district. Not to the market, to the neighborhoods below, to where the dock workers and day laborers lived. He was looking for a specific man. He found him at a labor pool near the western pier. A man in his 40s, broad as a wardrobe, fists the size of a child's head. His name was Cho Mugil, a former sergeant in the city guard, dismissed for fighting an officer. He worked as a dock worker for 2 ryang a month. He had 3 children and a wife who was sick every winter. Taiwan approached him during lunch, sat down next to him, said he had a proposal. Not a security guard job. A job as head of port logistics for the Seoul Trading Union. Mughal looked at the boy as if he were crazy, asked what that meant. Taiwan explained. The Seoul warehouse needed someone to organize loading and unloading, to manage the loaders, to keep things in order, and yes, to ensure security as well. The salary is 5 ryangs, plus a bonus for each shipment. Mughal said it sounded like a security guard job with a fancy title. Taiwan smiled. He replied that the difference was that a security guard follows orders, but a logistics manager makes decisions, and that Mughal would have his own people. 3 loaders he would choose himself, 3 riangs each. Mughal thought about it for 2 days. Then he came to the warehouse and brought 3 men. Strong, silent, accustomed to hard work. They knew how to load and they knew how to fight. That was enough. Now Tevan had protection. Not an army, but 4 strong men who knew the port like the back of their hands. And he also had logistics. Mughal turned out to be smarter than he looked. He knew every pier in Myeongjin. He knew the tide schedules. He knew which ships arrived when. He knew which captains were trustworthy and which ones stole from the holds. In 2 weeks he had doubled the unloading speed of the Morning Heron. Tevan watched him and thought that in any system the most valuable resource was the people who had been underestimated. The 4th voyage began at the end of the 2nd month, but this time Tevan didn't sail himself. He stayed in Myeongjin. Han was in command of the ship. Ada went with her to keep records. Tevan stayed at the warehouse with Pae Gonsu and Mughal because he had another task. He wanted to meet an alchemist. The rumor had reached him through Pae Gonsu. In the southern district of Myeongjin, a woman lived in a semi-basement workshop. A young woman, 22 years old, a former student of the Royal Academy of Alchemy, expelled for insulting a teacher. In reality, for proving a mistake in a formula the professor had been teaching for 40 years. Her name was Oh Eugene. She was in debt. The workshop didn't belong to her, but to the landlord. Potion ingredients were expensive. She had almost no customers. Her reputation as an expelled student didn't help. Tevan went down to the basement. It smelled of sulfur and something bitter. A small woman with ink-stained fingers stood at the table, stirring something in a copper cauldron. She was thin. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun. Her eyes were quick and fierce. Tevan said he needed potions for seasickness. Eugene looked at him and asked how many. He replied that he wanted 20 vials to start with. She named her price. 5 won per vial, 100 won per batch. Tevan nodded, but he added that he had a second proposal. He would buy 20 vials from her. He would sell them to the captains at the port for 15 won each. 300 won in revenue, 200 in net profit, of which 100 would go to her. Not as payment for the potion, as a cut of the sales. Eugene stopped stirring. She turned to him. She asked who he was. Tevan introduced himself. So Tevan, so trade union. Eugene snorted. She said she'd heard. A boy who hauls salt and thinks he's a merchant. Tevan wasn't offended. He said she was an alchemist who brews potions in the basement and thinks she's a scientist. Both are right, and both are underappreciated for now. Eugene fell silent for a second. Then she laughed. For the first time during this conversation, she said he was brazen. Tevan replied that brazenness was a resource. Eugene said it was the silliest thing she'd ever heard, but 200 won in pure profit is 200 won. She agreed. The next day, Tevan stood at the pier with a box of vials, selling seasickness potions to the captains. 15 won each. The first 5 vials sold out in an hour, the rest in 2 days. The captains knew that on the open sea, half the crew would be vomiting for the first 24 hours. Eugene's potions relieved nausea in 10 minutes. It wasn't magic, it was alchemy, a mixture of herbs and minerals. But to the captains, it made no difference. If it works, they need it. Tevan returned to Eugene with the money. 100 won was her share. She counted it out. She looked at him. She asked when the next shipment would be. He replied that it would be in a week, and that he needed not 20 vials but 40, and something else, an ointment for frostbite, for the caravan drivers on the northern routes. Eugene said she could make it, but she needed ingredients that were expensive. Tevan said he would pay, and that it was an investment. Eugene asked what an investment was. Tevan explained that it was when you spend money now to make more later. Eugene said it sounded like a bet in a game of chance. Tevan replied that the difference was that a gambler doesn't calculate the odds, but he does. Han returned from her 4th voyage 10 days later, brought in 80 riang in profit. The voyages were becoming more profitable. Kwande Sik in Cheongju was now shipping salt on demand. The So receipts had become commonplace. They were accepted. They were trusted. Because behind each one stood a payment made on time. Not once. Not for a single day. Taewon never broke his promise. That was his greatest weapon. Not a sword. Not magic. Trust. Taewon hired Cho Mugi-il, a former guard, as head of port logistics, solving the security problem. He found the alchemist Oh Yu-jin and began selling her seasickness potions to captains at triple the price, splitting the profit 50-50. The fourth voyage brought in 280 riangs. So's warehouse receipts began to be accepted as a reliable means of payment. At the end of the third month, Taewon took stock. 5 voyages. Total profit of about 1,200 riangs. The warehouse in Myeongjin was operational. 4 merchants stored grain and used the receipts. Yujin brewed potions and ointments. Mugul ran the port. Ada kept the books. Paegonsu handled the paperwork, and Han steered the ship. 6 people, not counting the sailors. A small crew, but everyone in their place. Taewon sat in the office, at the root board, and thought about the next step. A second warehouse. Cheongju. It was a logical move. He bought salt in Cheongju and transported it to Myeongjin, but every time he paid port fees, warehouse fees, Kwan's commission. If he set up his own warehouse in Cheongju, he would cut 2 links out of the chain. He would buy salt directly from the miners, store it himself, load it himself. Savings of up to 30% on every trip. But a warehouse in another city required money and manpower. He had the money. 300 ryong would be enough for rent and the first month of operations. Manpower. Taewon thought about it for 3 days. Then he summoned Bae Gonsu. The old man came and sat across from him. Taewon said he was sending him to Cheongju to open a second warehouse, to manage it, to hire people, to keep records, communication via couriers every 5 days. Bae Gonsu listened. Then he asked why him. Taewon replied that it was because Bae Gonsu was the only one on the team who knew how the bureaucracy worked. Renting in a foreign city involves paperwork, permits, seals, officials. Bae Gonsu had worked with officials for 20 years. He knew their language, their weaknesses, their prices. The old man smiled. He said the boy was right, and that he would go. A week later, Bae Gonsu left for Cheongju with 300 ryong and a detailed 6-page instruction sheet. Taewon had spent 2 days writing those instructions, every single point. The warehouse must have a capacity of at least 500 sacks. It must be located no more than 2 blocks from the port. Rent must not exceed 20 ryong a month. Hire 2 porters and 1 guard. Keep an account book modeled after Myeongjin's. And most importantly, no deals on behalf of the union without Taewon's written consent. Bae Gonsu nodded. He took the papers and left. Taewon remained in Myeongjin with the feeling that for the first time he had relinquished some control. It was necessary, and it was scary. Around the same time, something that Taewon hadn't planned. Eugene came to see him at the warehouse late that evening, angry, red spots on her cheeks, ink on her forehead. She threw a stack of papers on the table and said she was being evicted. The workshop owner had sold the building. The new owner was giving her 3 days to pack up. Supplies, cauldrons, tools, everything she'd collected over 4 years. She had nowhere to go. Taewon looked at the papers, then at her. He asked how much her equipment was worth. Eugene replied that it was about 150 rangs, if sold in parts. Taewon said he wouldn't sell it. He said the second floor of his warehouse was big enough for a workshop. Eugene could move everything there, for free, no rent. In exchange, Eugene would work for the So Union, not as a hired alchemist, as a partner, a share of the profits from the sale of potions and ointments. Eugene was silent. Then she quietly asked why. Taewon replied that it was because she was the only alchemist on the coast who could do what she could do, and because the seasickness potions had brought in more profit in 2 months than his first salt shipment. Eugene pressed her lips together. Then she said she had a condition. She wouldn't do anything that went against her principles. No poisons, no love potions, no counterfeits. Taewon nodded. He said he needed medicines and preservatives, not poisons. Eugene moved in 2 days later. The second floor of the warehouse turned into a laboratory. Cauldrons, test tubes, the smell of sulfur and herbs. Ara complained that the smell gave her a headache. Eugene complained that Ara's numbers gave her a headache. They argued every day. Taewon listened and said nothing, because the work was getting done. During her first week at the new place, Eugene cooked up a batch of grain preservatives, a powder that slowed decay by half. 1 dose per sack cost half a won to produce. A sack of grain treated with this powder could be stored for 3 months instead of 1.5. Taewon did the math. If all the grain in the warehouse were treated, spoilage losses would drop from 15% to 3%. For 1,000 sacks, that's a savings of 200 ryangs per season. The cost of the powder for 1,000 sacks is 5 riangs. The return on investment is 4,000%. Tevin showed these figures to Eugene. She looked at them. Then she looked at him. Then she said she hated it when he was right. But the powder worked, and the numbers didn't lie. The 6th and 7th voyages went off without a hitch. Han steered the ship confidently. The crew had gelled. Tejo became a senior sailor. Mal was still coughing but worked as hard as 2 men. Bokcha cooked and mended the sails. Profits were growing. Not sharply, steadily. 270, 300 riangs per voyage. Taiwan wasn't chasing the maximum. He was chasing stability. Because stability is trust, and trust is capital. At the end of the 4th month, he received a letter from Pei Gonsu in Cheongju. The warehouse is open. A location has been found. 2 porters have been hired. The first merchant has delivered goods. The receipts are in order. And there's more news. Quan Dasik is requesting a meeting. He wants to discuss a long-term partnership. Taiwan read the letter. He smiled. A long-term partnership. Quan sensed that the boy was growing up, and he wants to hitch his wagon to Taiwan's train while he still can. Fine, let him come. In this world, there were people who needed to be defeated, and people you had to invite. Taiwan sent Bei Gonsu to open a second warehouse in Cheongju with a budget of 300 riang and detailed instructions. Oyu Jin moved to a workshop on the 2nd floor of the warehouse in Myeongjin after being evicted from her old workshop. She invented a grain preservative that reduced losses from 15 to 3%. Quan Dae-sik from Cheongju requested a meeting to discuss a long-term partnership. Quan Dae-sik came to Myeongjin in person. That spoke volumes. A major merchant doesn't visit a 14-year-old boy. He sends a messenger. If Quan came himself, it meant he took the situation seriously. The meeting took place in the office above the warehouse. Taiwan sat at the table. Ara stood slightly behind him with the books. Quan entered. He sat down. He placed his hands on the table. His gold rings glinted in the light of the oil lamp. He said he had come with a simple proposal. He wanted to invest 500 riang in the So Trade Union. In return, he wanted a 20% share of all profits and a vote in the union's decisions. Taiwan listened. He was silent. Then he said no, not on those terms. Quan raised an eyebrow. Taiwan explained, 20% of the profits was too much for 500 riangs. The union was already bringing in 300 riangs a month. In a year and a half, Quan's investment would pay for itself, and after that, he would keep getting money just for having once placed a pouch on the table. That wasn't a partnership, it was a rent. Taiwan offered something else. Quan would invest 500 riangs. He receives not a share of the profits, but a promissory note. A document guaranteeing the return of 500 riangs in 6 months plus 12% on top. 60 riangs in income over 6 months. No voting rights, no involvement in management, a purely financial investment. Quan frowned. He said it sounded like a regular debt. Taiwan replied that it wasn't a debt. It was a promissory note. The difference was that a promissory note could be transferred. Quan could sell this paper to another merchant if he needed money before the due date. The paper works like money, only better, because money sits idle while a promissory note yields 12%. Quan was silent for a long time. Then he asked, what if the So Union couldn't pay in 6 months? Taiwan showed him the books. Ara opened the income ledger. 5 months of work, every voyage profitable, every receipt paid on time, growth trends. The numbers didn't lie. Quan looked at the ledger, at the boy, at the girl with the ledger. He asked who kept the books. Taiwan replied that it was Son Ara, the daughter of Sun Yun-ho, the former treasurer of the So House. Quan nodded. He knew Sun Yun-ho. He knew he was an honest man. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. After 2 hours of bargaining, Quan agreed. 500 riang on a So Union promissory note, repayable in 6 months with 12% interest. The first bearer promissory note in the history of Haegyong. Taiwan wrote it in his own hand. The So Union seal, signature, date, amount, term, conditions. Ara recorded it in the ledger. Quan put the paper in his wallet. He looked at Taiwan and said the boy was either a genius or a madman. Taiwan replied that one didn't preclude the other. Quan left. Ara closed the notebook. She looked at Taiwan. She said quietly that 500 riang was a lot of money. Taiwan replied that 500 riangs was the second warehouse in Seho, the third node in the network. Ada asked if the third city was definitely Seho. Taiwan walked over to the board on the wall. He pointed it out. Myeongjin on the coast, Cheongju to the south, Seho at the intersection of two roads. One goes north along the river, the other goes east over the pass. Whoever controls Seho controls the flow of goods between the three kingdoms. And one more thing, Seho is the city of the Cho house, the second of the three houses that destroyed his father. Ada understood. Taiwan wasn't just building a network, he was building it so that every new node would drive a wedge into the enemy's foundation. A week after meeting with Quan, what Taiwan had been waiting for and fearing happened. At night in the warehouse, Taiwan was working late. Ada had gone to bed. Mughal stood at the door. Two of his men were patrolling the perimeter. Taiwan sat at the table, drafting a plan to open a warehouse in Seho. The door creaked. He looked up. Mughal stood in the doorway. His face was pale. He said they'd found a man at the pier, dead, with a knife in his back. It was one of the merchants who stored grain at the So warehouse, a small-time trader named Lee Chang-soo, a quiet man. He'd been trading grain for 10 years. Yesterday, in front of Tivan, he'd paid off a warehouse receipt for a shipment of fabric. Today, he was dead. Tivan stood up. He went down to the pier. The body lay on the wet planks. The city guard was already there. 2 guards, sleepy, indifferent. To them, he was just another dead body at the port. Tivan stood and watched. He knew this was a message, not to him personally, to everyone who works with the So Union. Look, think, be afraid. He returned to the warehouse, sat down at the table. His hands didn't tremble. Inside, it was cold and quiet. The man from his past life, Daniel So, had never seen dead bodies. The man from this life, So Tivan, had just seen his first. He sat there until dawn. Then he made a decision. In the morning, he went to Lee Chang-soo's family, the widow, 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. Taiwan knelt before the widow. He said that Lee Chang-soo had died because he worked with the So Union, and that the union was responsible for its own. He handed her a small bag, 100 riang, a small merchant's annual income, and a receipt. The paper stated that the So Trade Union undertook to pay Lee Chang-soo's widow 5 riang monthly until the eldest child reached the age of majority. The widow took the bag. She looked at the receipt. She began to cry. Taiwan left. Han was waiting for him on the street. She had heard everything. She remained silent. Then she said that he had just spent the money that had been set aside for Seho. Taiwan replied that he knew, but if he didn't pay the widow today, tomorrow no merchant would trust the So Union with a sack of grain. Reputation is worth more than a warehouse. Han looked at him, and for the first time she didn't call him boy. She said his name, Tevan. Kwande Sik invested 500 riang in the So Union, receiving the first bearer bond in Haegyong's history. Tevan planned a third warehouse in Seho, in the Cho family's district. Merchant Lee Chang-soo, who worked with the union, was stabbed in the back at the pier. Tevan paid his widow 100 riangs and arranged for a monthly allowance, using funds set aside for expansion. A week passed after Lee Chang-soo's murder. 2 merchants took grain from the warehouse. They were frightened. Tevan did not try to dissuade them. He didn't ask. He simply continued working. The remaining 2 watched and waited. 5 days later, one of those who had left returned, quietly, without explanation. He brought a double batch to the warehouse. He said only that his wife had ordered it, that Lee Chang-soo's widow had told the neighbors about the receipt, that the whole port district was saying the same thing, that the boy so pays even for the dead. Taiwan nodded. He accepted the grain. He wrote out a receipt, and he realized he had just received more than money. He had received a story that works better than any advertisement. In this world where news spread as fast as gossip, an action was worth more than 1,000 words. On the 10th day after the murder, Taiwan gathered his team. Han, Ara, Yujin, Mughal, everyone in the office. Doors closed. Taiwan said the time had come for a change. They were no longer a small cooperative that transported salt. They were a trading union, and a union needed structure. He laid out papers on the table. On each, a name and responsibilities. Han Riel, captain of the Union fleet, responsible for all maritime transport. 1 ship now. 3 in a year. Son Ara, chief treasurer. All money, all receipts, all ledgers go through her. Oh Eugene, head of production. Potions, ointments, preservatives. Everything the union makes with its own hands rather than reselling. Chue Mugil, head of security and logistics, ports, warehouses, security, personnel. Be Gonsu, branch manager, Cheongju now, Seho in 3 months. Everyone receives a base salary, plus a share of the union's profits proportional to their contribution. Taiwan will discuss specific figures with each person individually, but the principle is the same. Everyone has a stake, everyone is invested, no one is a mercenary. Han listened in silence. Then she asked who he was in this structure. Taevan replied, head of the union, strategy, finance, negotiations. And one more thing, he would build a system of couriers, a fast connection between cities, because whoever knows the prices first buys first. Eugene raised her hand. She said she had a question. What is a fleet? Han almost smiled. Taiwan explained that for now, the fleet consisted of a single morning heron, but in a year, there would be 3 ships. Eugene asked where the money would come from. Taiwan replied that it would come from the proceeds of her potions, among other sources. Eugene opened her mouth. She closed it. Then she said that if he was right again, she would personally poison his tea. Everyone laughed. For the first time in 10 days. 2 days after the meeting, Taiwan set off. For the first time, not to Cheongju, to Seho, a city at the crossroads, the city of the Che house. Han wanted to go with him. Taiwan said no. She had to lead the 8th voyage. Money doesn't wait. Mughal wanted to send 2 men. Taiwan agreed to 1. A big guy named Taehyun, quiet, strong, doesn't ask questions. They set out on horseback at dawn. The road to Seho took 6 days, through hills and river valleys. On the way, Taiwan thought, Seho was the key, not because roads crossed there, but because river transport was controlled from there. The Che house owned the docks on the Nakten River, 3 docks. Half of the river traffic between the 2 kingdoms passed through them. Whoever owned these docks dictated the prices for transport. Taiwan had no intention of fighting for the docks. He intended to make them unnecessary. On the 3rd day of their journey, they stopped in a village by the river, a small one, 20 houses, rice fields. It smelled of smoke and wet earth. Taiwan went into the tavern, the only one in the whole village. The owner stood behind the counter, an old man with a wrinkled face. Taiwan ordered rice and fish. While he ate, he listened to the conversations. 2 men at the next table were complaining. The Cho family had raised the toll for river passage, again, for the 3rd time this year. A sack of grain from Seho to Myeongjin now cost 4 won more, just because of the river toll. 4 won. Taiwan finished eating. He paid the bill. He went outside. He stood on the riverbank and looked at the water. 4 won per sack. 4,000 won for 1,000 sacks. 40 ryong from every caravan. The Cho family received 40 ryong for nothing, simply because the river flowed past their docks. A parasitic rent, the most stable form of income, and the most vulnerable, because rent only works as long as there is no alternative. And Taiwan was going to create an alternative, not a river, a road. They arrived in Seho on the 6th day. The city was larger than Myeongjin, stone walls, 3 gates, a market square in the center, river docks, flags bearing the Choa family crest at every pier, a yellow shield with a black fish. Taiwan didn't go to the docks. He went to the market. He walked around for 2 days. He wrote down prices, names, connections, who owed whom, who was dissatisfied, who was afraid. Information, always information. On the 3rd day, he found what he was looking for. A place, a stone house on Market Street, 2 stories. The first floor was large and dry. The owner was the widow of a cloth merchant. The rent was 18 ryangs a month. Taiwan rented it for 6 months. He paid 2 months in advance, 36 ryangs. He signed the contract. He stamped it with the So Union seal. The widow looked at the boy and said nothing. Then she asked if he wasn't too young for such a thing. Taiwan replied that age is just a number, and a number doesn't determine reliability. Reliability is determined by actions. He left Taehyun in Seho to look after the place until the man from Cheongju arrived. Baek Gonsu had promised to send the junior manager. Taiwan rode back alone, 6 days on horseback, alone on an empty road. It was dangerous, and he knew it. But there weren't enough guards. There weren't enough people. There wasn't enough money. There was a shortage of everything. On the 3rd day of his return journey, he stopped for the night at a roadside inn. He lay down, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, his body remembered on its own. Not him, the body. The 14-year-old boy he had replaced. The memories came in fragments, the scent of his mother's hands, his father's warm voice reciting the evening prayer. Laughter, someone's laughter, maybe a sister he never had, or a friend he never knew. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Tevon didn't understand why he was crying. These weren't his tears. This body remembered a love he didn't know, and it grieved for people he hadn't had time to love. He lay in the darkness and let the tears flow. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't stop them, because this body deserved its grief, even if the mind inside it was someone else's. Tevon formalized the union structure by assigning each team member a specific role and a share of the profits. He personally traveled to Seho and rented a space for a third warehouse in the city dominated by the Cho house. He discovered that Cho was charging a parasitic toll for river transport and began to consider a land-based alternative. On the Mopa, he experienced the first breakthrough in the physical memory of the former Taiwan. Taiwan returned to Myeongjin at the end of the 5th month. Ada met him at the warehouse entrance. Her face was pale. She said that 2 events had occurred while he was away. The first was good. The 8th voyage brought in 310 riangs, a record. Khan had found a new buyer in Myeongjin, a large salting cooperative that took 600 sacks at once. The second was bad. An official from the city council had arrived at the port with a document, an order to inspect the warehouse operations of the So Trading Union. The reason? A complaint from an unnamed individual regarding possible irregularities in the handling of receipts. Tevon took the document. He read it. He looked at the seal. Genuine. City Council. Office of Trade Affairs. Signed by the head of the office, Moon Ji-won. Tevon knew that name. Bae Gonsu had told him. Moon Ji-won had been in office for 30 years. He takes a moderate amount. Not greedy, but not honest either. A standard mid-level bureaucrat. The question was who had filed the complaint. The Park family, obviously. After Lee Chang-soo's murder, it hadn't worked. A direct threat through a messenger hadn't worked. Now they were trying a third approach, the bureaucratic one, the slowest, but also the most dangerous. Because if the audit finds any violation, even a technical one, the warehouse could be shut down, the receipts could be voided, and that's death. Not physical, economic. Taiwan sat down at the table. He thought for an hour. Then he called Ara. He asked for all the books, all of them, for 5 months. Every notebook, every receipt, every receipt. Ara brought them, a stack of papers half a foot high. Taiwan began checking, line by line, page by page. Ara checked alongside him. They worked for 2 days, slept 4 hours each. Eugene brought tea and grumbled that they'd both die of exhaustion before they died at the hands of their enemies. At the end of the 2nd day, Taiwan leaned back in his chair. The books were clean. Ara had kept them flawlessly. Every coin was accounted for. Every receipt was recorded. Every item in the warehouse matched the records. No irregularities. Teven smiled, but he didn't relax, because the absence of irregularities doesn't mean the inspector won't find any. An inspector can find anything if he's been paid to do so. So a different approach was needed. Don't defend, attack. On the morning of the 3rd day, Teven put on the best clothes he had, a simple but clean robe, a belt, shoes without holes. He tucked the books under his arm and went to City Hall, straight to the head of the office, Moon Ji-won. The official received him after an hour of waiting. A small office, dark furniture, the smell of ink and dust. Moon Ji-won was sitting at his desk, a thin man in his 50s with tired eyes and a neat beard. He looked at the boy, asked what he wanted. Taewon placed the books on the desk. That's all. He said he had come on his own, not to wait for an audit, but to show everything voluntarily. Every transaction, every receipt, every coin. Here are the books. Here are the receipts. Here is the inventory of goods in the warehouse. He invites Mr. Moon to conduct the inspection right now, in person. Moon blinked. In 30 years, no one had ever come to him voluntarily. Usually merchants hid their books, falsified the numbers. They tried to bribe him, but this boy had brought everything himself. Moon took the first ledger. He opened it. He began to read. Taewon sat and waited. Moon read for a long time, half an hour. Then he looked up. He said the records were impeccable and asked who kept the books. Taewon replied that it was Sonata. Moon nodded. Then he said quietly that the complaint had come from a respected firm and that it would be difficult for him to simply close the case without consequences. Taewon had expected this. He pulled another piece of paper from his bosom. Not a bribe, a proposal. The So Trade Union is ready to provide the Trade Affairs Office with a full report on warehouse operations every quarter, voluntarily, free of charge, in a standard form that Taewon developed himself, with all the figures, every item, every receipt, every transaction. Moon looked at the paper, then at the boy. He asked why he needed this. Taewon explained, if the So Union reports voluntarily, then every future complaint can be verified in a minute. The office saves time, the union saves nerves, and another thing, If this reporting format proves itself, the office might recommend it to other trading houses. Tevin looked Moon in the eye. Other houses. The Pack House, for example. Moon understood. The boy wasn't just proposing a reporting system. He was proposing a standard the Chancellery could impose on everyone, and then it wouldn't be so under scrutiny anymore. But those who refused to adopt the standard. Moon was silent for a minute. Then he asked what salary the head of the Trade Affairs Office received. Tevin replied that he didn't know. Moon said 12 riang a month. In 30 years, he hadn't received a single raise. Tevin said that the So Union was prepared to provide the office with paper and ink for a year on a charitable basis. The cost was approximately 30 riang, not a bribe, a donation for the needs of a government agency, formally documented with a receipt and a seal. Moon looked at the boy and said nothing. Then he said quietly that the complaint would be dismissed for lack of grounds, and that he was expecting the first quarterly report in 3 months. Tevin bowed. He took the books. He left. Outside, the sun was blinding. He squinted and stood there for a second. Then he walked to the warehouse. He thought as he went, the Park House had lost the 3rd round. The messenger hadn't worked. The murder hadn't worked. The inspection hadn't worked. But they wouldn't stop. Every subsequent attack would be stronger. He needed to grow faster than they struck. Eugene was waiting for him at the warehouse. She stood by the door, holding a small vial of dark liquid in her hands. She said she had news. She'd made something new, an antiseptic for wounds, simple, cheap, and very effective. An alcohol solution with added alchemical extract. 1 vial could treat 20 wounds. The production cost was 2 vona. The market price, if sold to doctors and army surgeons, is no less than 20. Tevin took the vial. He held it up to the light, a dark liquid with a pungent odor. He asked if it really worked. Eugene replied that she had tested it on herself. She cut her finger and treated it. The wound healed twice as fast, without infection. Tevin looked at her bandaged finger, then at her. He said she was crazy. Eugene replied that he had started it. Tevin put the vial in his pocket. Numbers were already spinning in his head. Antiseptic, 20 won apiece. If Eugene makes 10 a day, 200 won, 2 riang, 60 riang a month from just one product. And this isn't salt, which every other merchant carries. It's a unique commodity, a monopoly. True value isn't in what you resell, it's in what you do that no one else can. He returned to the office, sat down at the desk, took out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write a plan for the next 6 months. 3 areas: trade, manufacturing, finance. Each area is a river of money. 3 rivers merge into a single channel, the So Trade Union. He wrote until dark. Ara brought dinner, rice and fish. He ate without looking up from his papers. Little Miri climbed onto his lap and fell asleep. Tevin wrote with one hand while holding the sleeping child with the other, and for a second, it seemed to him that this was his life, not someone else's, not stolen, his. The Pak House initiated an audit of the So Union through the city office. Tevin went to see the official Moon Ji-wan voluntarily, bringing a complete set of books, and proposed introducing a standard quarterly reporting system for all trading houses. The audit was closed. Eugene created a wound antiseptic with a huge profit margin. Tevin drew up a strategic development plan in 3 areas for the next 6 months. The 6th month began with news that changed everything. A messenger from Cheongju arrived at dawn. Soaked from the rain, he drove his horse in. A letter from Bae Gonsu. Taewon opened the envelope and read it while standing at the warehouse door. The Cho House had dammed the river, completely. Not a single caravan passes through Seho without paying triple duty. Merchants are standing at the docks. Goods are rotting. Grain prices in the northern provinces have doubled in a week. Bae Gonsu wrote that the warehouse in Seho is still operating, but if the blockade lasts a month, there will be nothing left to store. Taewon folded the letter. He looked at Han, who was standing nearby. She already knew from the look on his face. Bad. Taewon nodded. Bad, but not hopeless. He sat down at the table and unfolded the map. The Noctone River, 3 docks belonging to the Cho House, 1 at Seho, 2 further downstream, all 3 under control. Whoever controls the river controls the trade. But the river isn't the only route. Taewon ran his finger along the map. From Cheongju to Seho, 6 days by river. Overland through the hills and the pass, 12. Twice as long, twice as expensive. That's exactly why everyone traveled by river. That's exactly why the Cho House could charge triple. But if we shorten the overland route, if we find a road that no one uses, Taiwan remembered the village by the river, the very one where he'd stopped on his way to Seho. 20 houses, rice fields, an inn, and the old road through the gorge he'd seen at the entrance. Overgrown, forgotten, but a road. He asked Han if she knew that gorge. Han nodded. She said that 30 years ago, caravans used to pass through it until the bridge over the stream collapsed. After the collapse, everyone switched to the river, and the Cho family bought the docks. Taiwan asked how much it would cost to build a bridge. Han looked at him as if he were crazy. She said she had no idea. She's a captain, not a builder. Taiwan said he needed a builder. Mugil found one in 2 days, a master named Zhang Il-su, 60 years old. He built bridges for the royal army until he retired. He lived in the suburbs of Myeongjin. Taiwan went to see him with a map and a question. How much would it cost to build a bridge over the stream in the gorge halfway between Cheongju and Seho? A wooden one, a simple one, for caravans with loaded wagons. Zhang Il-su looked at the map. He shook his head. He said he knew the place. The stream wasn't wide. The banks are rocky. A team of 10 men could build the bridge in 3 weeks. The cost, including materials and labor, is about 180 ryang. Taiwan nodded. 180 ryang. Compared to the Cho family's river toll of 40 ryang per caravan, the bridge would pay for itself in 5 caravans, in 2 months. He hired Zhang Il-su. He paid an advance of 50 ryang. A crew was assembled from locals. Construction of the bridge began in the 3rd week of the 6th month. At the same time, Taiwan was tackling the second problem, money. Kwan's promissory note was due in a month. 500 ryang plus 60% interest, 560. The union had 400 in its accounts. 160 was missing. The bridge would cost another 180. In total, he needed to find 340 ryangs in a month. Taiwan sat in the office at night and did the math. Ara sat across from him and did the math too, silently. Then she looked up. She said there was an option. Eugene. Her antiseptic had brought in 120 ryangs. The seasickness potions another 80. Preservatives, 40. 240 ryangs from a single alchemist. If they doubled production. Taiwan shook his head. Eugene was already working 16-hour days. She couldn't physically handle anymore. Ara said she could, if they hired her an assistant, someone who would do the simple tasks, stirring, pouring, packing, and Eugene would just brew. Division of labor. Taiwan looked at Ara. A 16-year-old girl had just invented the assembly line, or reinvented it. It didn't matter. She was right. The next day, Taiwan hired 2 assistants for Eugene, young women from the port district. Eugene screamed that she wouldn't tolerate strangers' hands in her lab. Taiwan listened. Then he showed her the numbers. With 2 assistants, she produces 3 times as much, 360 ryangs a month instead of 120. Eugene looked at the numbers, then at Taiwan. Then she said she hated math, and hated it when he was right. But she took the assistants. By the end of the 6th month, the bridge was built. Simple, wooden, sturdy. The first caravan passed through the gorge without a single coin in tolls to the House of Cho. The route was 3 days longer than the river route, but free. When the news reached Seho, the merchants began to do the math. Cho's triple toll, or 3 extra days of travel. The arithmetic was obvious. Within 2 weeks, river traffic through the Cho House docks had fallen by 1/3. The head of the Cho House, Cho Bonhuan, heard the name Seo Taiwan for the first time, not as an irritant, but as a problem. The Cho House blocked the river with a triple duty, paralyzing trade. Taiwan found an abandoned overland route through the gorge, and in 3 weeks built a bridge costing 180 ryang, creating a free alternative route. Ara suggested hiring assistants for Eugene, tripling the production of potions. The Cho House's river traffic Chui House fell by 1/3. The 7th month was a month of war, not with swords, with papers. The Chui House responded quickly. Chui Bonhuan filed a petition with the Seho Chancellery to have the gorge and the bridge recognized as an illegal passage through lands belonging to the Chui House. The papers were prepared competently, old land rights deeds, seals from 30 years ago, signatures of witnesses who had already passed away. If the petition were approved, the bridge would have to be torn down, the caravans would return to the river, and the House of Chui would once again be the master. Taiwan learned of this from Baekgon-su via a messenger. He read the letter. He sat down. He thought about it for a day. Then he wrote a reply. Not on behalf of the So Union, on behalf of the village by the gorge. 20 households, peasants who had lived on this land for 30 years, who had worked it, paid taxes, and who had their own deeds. Taiwan knew this because, while passing through the village, he had spoken with the village head, and he remembered that the village head had complained about the house of Chui, which 10 years ago had tried to take their pasture away through the courts and lost. So there was already a precedent. The land belonged to the peasants. The bridge stood on peasant land. The Cho family's deeds were either forged or had expired. Taiwan sent Pei Gonsu to the village, with money and an offer. The So Union would take the village under its protection, pay for the bridge's upkeep, supply the village with grain at cost. In return, the village would hit a counter-petition to the chancellery, attaching its own documents. The village head agreed in a single evening. 3 weeks later, the Seiho chancellery reviewed both petitions and rejected the Cho house's complaint. The bridge remained. Cho Bonghuan lost the bureaucratic round, but he did not stop. In the 8th month, 2 men arrived at the union's office in S. Seiho. They said they worked for the Cho house and that they had a proposal. A meeting with Cho Bonghuan in person, at his estate, without guards. A conversation about peace. Taiwan received this message through Bei Gonsu. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he went. Han found out and came to see him at the pier before he left. She said it was a trap. Taiwan replied that it might be, but Cho Bonghuan is no fool. Murder on one's own estate is not the same as a knife in the back at the river pier. This is war, open war, with consequences. Cho Bonghuan isn't ready for war. He's ready for negotiations. Han said she would go with him. Taiwan said no. Mugil, alone. That was enough. Cho Bonghuan's estate stood on a hill above the river, beautiful, a tiled roof, a garden with stone lanterns, servants in matching robes, wealth accumulated over 3 generations. Taiwan was led into the reception hall, a low table, cushions on the floor, tea in porcelain cups. Cho Bonghuan sat across from him, a man of 45, thin, a sharp face, eyes that didn't smile even when his lips did. He looked at the boy, said he was impressed. In 8 months, from nothing to a trading union with 3 warehouses and a bridge. Taiwan bowed. He said he was flattered. Cho Bonghuan got down to business. He wanted Taiwan to tear down the bridge. In return, the House of Cho would lower the river toll to its previous level and give the So Union a preferential rate, a 10% discount on all shipments. Taiwan listened. Then he said no. Bonghuan raised an eyebrow. Taiwan explained, "The bridge is already built. The caravans are already passing through. The merchants have already gotten used to it. Demolishing the bridge means losing their trust, and trust is the only thing he has." Bonghuan asked what he wanted. Taiwan replied, he wanted to lease one of the Che House's 3 docks. Not buy, lease, for 5 years. At a fixed price, the bridge would remain, but those caravans that preferred the river would pass through the So Union's dock, at a fair toll, not triple, fair, everyone wins. The Che House gets rent, the merchants get a choice, the Union gets a presence on the river. Bonghuan was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly that a boy had come to his house and was offering to take part of his river. Taiwan replied that he wasn't taking it, renting it. Those are different things. Taking is by force. You rent for money. He named a price. 200 riang a year, Bonghuan thought. 1 pier out of 3. 200 riang a year. River traffic had already fallen by 1/3 because of the bridge. If it fell any further, the piers would become unprofitable. 200 riang is better than nothing, he agreed. They signed a lease agreement, 5 years, 200 riang a year, pier number 2 on the Nakton River within the city limits of Seiho. Taiwan affixed the So Union's seal. Bonghuan affixed the Cho House's seal. They drank tea in silence. Then Bonghuan said one sentence that Taiwan would remember forever. He said that 5 years ago, he had been asked to sign papers against the So House. He signed not because he wanted to, but because he was promised a river monopoly. Taiwan froze. He asked who had made the promise. Bonghuan smiled. He said the boy was smart. Let him figure it out for himself. Taiwan rode back to Myeongjin and thought. Someone had promised the House of Che a river monopoly in exchange for a signature against the House of So. Not the House of Park. Park didn't have that kind of authority.
Only the one who controls the licenses can grant a monopoly on the river. The Royal Chancellery. An official. A high-ranking official. Perhaps the highest-ranking one. His father knew something. He wrote it down. He hid it. Second shelf on the right. In the secretary's desk, which Taewon no longer had, because he sold it for a pittance in the first month. The secretary's desk could be anywhere, with anyone. But Taewon remembered. And he would find it.
Tevin fended off the Cho House's legal attack on the bridge by countering with a petition from the village peasants. He met personally with Cho Bonhwan and leased a river pier from him for 5 years at 200 ryang a year. Bonhwan hinted that the ruin of the So House had been orchestrated by a high-ranking official who had promised a river monopoly. Taewon realized that he needed to find his father's secretary and the secret documents. By the end of the first year, the So Trading Union had grown to the size Taewon had planned for the second year. 3 warehouses, Myeongjin, Cheongju, and Seho, 1 ship and 1 river pier, 23 people on the payroll, a turnover of 4,000 ryang per month. The union's receipts were accepted in 2 cities as legal tender on par with silver. Yujin produced 5 types of goods: seasickness remedies, antiseptics, grain preservatives, ointments for frostbite, and a new product, a treatment for impregnating sailcloth, making it more resistant to salt and wind. Han tested the treatment on the sails of the Morning Heron and said the sails would last twice as long. Captains in the port of Myeongjin were lining up. Taewon sat in his office, counting not profit, but time. He understood that whoever was behind the ruin of the So House knew about him, knew that the boy was growing up, knew that my way through the gorge is not just a bridge, but a blow to the system that this man has built. And sooner or later, this man will strike. Not through the Park House, not through the Cho House, personally. He needed his father's papers. Taewon began searching for the secretary, quietly, through Pei Gonsu and his connections among former officials, through Mugi Il and his people at the port, through Ara, who was checking the records of all auctions and property sales over the past 5 years. In the 3rd week of the search, Ara found it, an entry in the city auction book. A dark wood secretary desk with a carved pediment, sold for 12 ryang to a furniture dealer named Nam Chi-soo. Taewon found Nam Chi-soo in a shop on the outskirts of Myeongjin, a fat man with oily eyes and a habit of touching his chin. Taewon asked about the secretary desk. Nam Chi-soo thought. He remembered. He said he had sold it 3 years ago, to a lady from Seho. He didn't remember the name. Taewon paid 10 ryang for the name. Nam Chi-soo remembered faster. Lady Yoon, the wife of the head of the House of Yoon. Taewon froze. The House of Yoon, the 3rd of the 3 houses that had destroyed his father. It controls the salt mines of Hedan. The wife of the head of the Yoon house bought his father's secretary desk. A coincidence, or not. If the Yoon house knew something was hidden in the desk, they would have taken it apart and destroyed the papers. But if the wife bought it, for beauty's sake, for the decor, then the false bottom might have remained intact. Taewon returned to the warehouse. He sat down. He thought until nightfall. Then he called Han. He said he needed to get into the Yoon residence in Haedong. Han asked how. Taewon replied that he didn't know, yet, but he knew who to ask. The next day he wrote a letter. Addressee, Cheongbok Monastery in the suburbs of the capital, Haedong. Name, Jung Ha-in. He knew about her from Bae Gonsu, the king's half-sister, sent to the monastery after her mother fell from grace. 19 years old, quiet, intelligent, forgotten by everyone. Taewon wrote her neither a petition nor a plea. He wrote a business proposal. He explained who he was, what he had accomplished in a year, what assets he possessed, what his plans were, and what he wanted. Access to the court, not through bribery, through partnership. He proposed that the princess become the union's representative at court, with a salary, with a share of the profits, with real authority. In return, he asked for one thing: information. Who at court was on whose side, who was against whom, and who was behind the forged grain receipts through which money had been siphoned from the Hedan treasury for 5 years. The letter was sent by messenger. The reply arrived 12 days later. Brief, neat handwriting, small letters. Jung Ha-in wrote that she had read his proposal, that she was surprised. That for the first time in 7 years, someone other than the abbot had written to her, and that she agreed to meet him. But not at the monastery. At the tea house by the western gate of the capital. In a week. Alone. Taewon traveled to the capital of Hadan for the first time. A 3-day journey. Mugil traveled with him. Han wanted to go too, but Taewon said the ship needed a captain, not a bodyguard. The capital of Hadan was called Wangjan, a big city, walls 3 men high, a palace complex on a hill, markets, temples, government offices, the smell of roasted meat and incense. The tea house by the western gate turned out to be a small, quiet establishment with paper partitions and the scent of jasmine. Taewon entered. A woman was sitting at a table by the window, young, pale, dark eyes, a simple, unadorned dress. She was staring into her cup and didn't look up when he entered. Taewon sat across from her. He introduced himself. So Taewon, she looked up. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that he was younger than she had expected. Taewon replied that he was older than he looked. She smiled slightly, the first smile he had seen from her. They talked for 2 hours, quietly. She told him stories, about the court, about the king who was ill and hadn't left his bed for months, about the first minister, Kim Seong-jun, who ruled in the king's stead and whose word was law, about how the House of Yoon supplied salt to the palace under a contract signed personally by Kim Seong-jun, about how every year money was taken from the treasury to purchase grain that no one had ever seen. Taewon listened. Every word fell into place in the puzzle he had been piecing together for a year. Kim Seong-jun, the first minister, the man behind it all, behind the ruin of the So family, behind the Che family's river monopoly, behind the Yoon family's salt contracts, behind the fake grain receipts, behind the 300,000 ryongs stolen from the treasury. Father found out, and father was killed, not by a knife, by money, which is worse. Ha-in asked what he was going to do. Taewon replied that nothing for now. Gather, count, wait, and that he needed a secretary from the Yoon household. Ha-in was silent. Then she said that the wife of the head of the Yoon household comes to Cheongbok Monastery to pray on the first day of every month. They know each other. She can find out where the secretary's desk is. Taewon looked at her. He said thank you. She shook her head. She said there was no need to thank her. For the first time in 7 years, she felt needed by someone alive, not by a dead god in an empty monastery. The secretary was found a month later. Ha-in wrote that it was in the guest room of the Yoon residence. Yoon's wife had bought it at an auction because she liked the carving. No one had opened it up. No one had looked for a false bottom. Taewon didn't steal it. He didn't send people out at night. He did something else. He bought it. Through a front man. Through an antique dealer from Wangjan who offered Mrs. Yoon a new mahogany secretary desk 3 times as expensive in exchange for the old one. Mrs. Yoon agreed happily. The old secretary desk was taken away on a cart. Taewon paid the antique dealer 100 ryang, 300 for the new secretary, a total of 400 ryang for the furniture, the most expensive purchase of his life. The secretary desk was delivered to Myeongjin at night. Mugil stood by the cart himself while the porters carried it up to the 2nd floor of the warehouse. Taewon closed the office door. He slid the bolt into place. He was left alone. He sat down on the floor in front of the secretary desk. He ran his hand over the wood. Worn, old, a scratch on the left corner, a mark from an ink stain on the lid. This wood held the memory of a man he had never known, but whose name he bore, whose body he bore, whose tears sometimes flowed down his cheeks for no reason and without permission. The 2nd shelf on the right. He pulled out the shelf. Ordinary, wood, nothing. He pressed on the bottom. Solid, doesn't move. Tried the left edge, the right, nothing. Sat back down. Thought. 2nd shelf from the right. A note from his father. Small handwriting at the edge of the page. Maybe not the 2nd from the top, but the 2nd from the bottom. He stood up. Tried the bottom section. 2nd shelf from the bottom. Right side. He pressed on the right corner of the bottom. It clicked. A quiet sound, as if a thin twig had snapped. The bottom of the shelf lifted half an inch. Taewon froze. His heart was racing. His hands were steady. He pried the edge with his fingers. A thin wooden plate. Masterful work. From the outside, indistinguishable from the regular bottom. Under the panel was a narrow space, no wider than a finger, and inside it was a bundle. Oiled paper tied with a silk cord. The oil had preserved the paper. 5 years in a hiding place, and not a trace of dampness. Father knew what he was hiding. He knew time might pass. He took care of it. Tevan untied the cord. He unfolded the paper. Inside were 17 sheets. Thin rice paper. Each sheet was a grain receipt. The seal of the royal treasury of Hadan. Round, red, with the image of a dragon. Date, amount, description. Purchase of grain for army garrisons in the northern province. Purchase of grain for starving coastal villages. Purchase of grain for the royal reserve in case of crop failure. Signature of the recipient of the funds. Signature confirming delivery. The signature on every receipt was the same. Kim Seong-jun, First Minister of the Kingdom of Hadan. Taewon read every receipt, slowly, one after another. The amounts: 10,000 ryong, 22,000, 15,000, 30,000, 12, 18, 17 receipts. Total amount: 312,000 ryong. Grain that was supposedly purchased for the army and the starving. Grain that did not exist. Not a single sack. Not a single grain. Money flowed out of the treasury based on these receipts and vanished. Into the First Minister's pockets. Into the pockets of his men. Into the pockets of the houses that helped carry out the scheme. The Park House supplied fictitious shipping documents for non-existent grain. The Cho House received payment for river transport that never took place. The Yoon House wrote off part of the stolen funds through its salt contracts as expenses for barter operations. 3 houses, 1 minister, 5 years, 312,000 ryong. Taiwan's father worked with the royal treasury. He supplied real grain, real ships, real people loaded real sacks, and at some point, he noticed, his deliveries didn't match the amounts in the treasury reports. He had supplied 50,000 ryong, but the report said 80, a difference of 30,000. Where did the money go? Who signed off on it? His father started digging, quietly, carefully. He found the receipts, he made copies, he hid the copies in his desk, and 3 months later, his partners simultaneously called in their loans. The ships came to a standstill, the debts were bought up by frontmen. The Soh House collapsed in a week, not out of greed, out of fear. Father knew too much, he had to be eliminated. Not with a knife, with money, which was easier, cleaner, and left no corpse that would raise questions. Father died of a heart attack a week after the bankruptcy. His heart couldn't take it. Mother passed away a year later. A body, just a body. A 14-year-old boy was left alone. And then, someone else awoke inside that body. Tavan sat on the floor, holding 17 sheets of paper in his hands. 312,000 reals. 1 life. 1 family. His hands didn't tremble. Inside, it was quiet and clear, like in a bank's trading room a minute before the market closes, when all the numbers are on the screen and the decision has already been made. He knew what to do, but not now, not today. Right now, he would hide the papers. He would make 3 copies, neatly, by hand. Every letter, every number. He would trace every stamp. 3 copies, 1 for Han. She would hide it on the ship in a secret compartment known only to her. 1 for Ha-in, at Cheongbok Monastery, where no one would look. 1 for Bae-gon-su, in Cheongju, in the safe that Taiwan had placed in the warehouse basement a month ago. If anything happened to him, the papers would survive. He worked all night, copying by the light of an oil lamp. His hand grew tired by the 3rd copy. The letters blurred. He clenched his fingers, relaxed them, continued. By dawn, 3 copies lay on the table. The originals back into the oiled paper, back into the secretary's secret compartment. A click. It closed, as if nothing had ever happened. In the morning, Taewon handed out the copies. Han took hers silently. She looked at him. She didn't ask anything. She turned and walked to the ship. Pae-gon-su took the envelope. He tucked it into his shirt. He nodded. The messenger with the 3rd copy left for Wangjiang to see Ha-in. A week later, Taewon went himself, to the capital, to Cheongbok Monastery, to see Ha-in. She was waiting for him in the garden, pale, dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept. Her hands on her knees, fingers clasped, She was anxious. Taewon sat down next to her on a stone bench. He took out the originals, placed them between her hands. Hyun unfolded them. She read in silence, page by page. Her face remained unchanged. Only her hands, her fingers clenched tighter with every page. She stopped at the 12th receipt. She looked up. In her eyes was something he had never seen before. Not fear, not anger. Determination. Quiet, steadfast, like a stone under water. She said the king was ill, that he hadn't left his bed for 4 months now, that there was no heir, that Kim Sung-jun was effectively ruling in his stead, signing decrees, appointing officials, allocating the treasury, and that if these papers surfaced before they had enough power to stand behind them, Kim Sung-jun would simply destroy everyone involved. Taewon nodded. He knew. That's why the papers would have to wait, but not for long. A year, maybe 2. He told Ha-in that in a year, the Seoul Union would be feeding 300,000 people. In 2 years, 1 million. When you're feeding 1 million people, you can't be killed quietly, because 1 million people will notice. 1 million people will ask where the bread has gone. 1 million people are an army that carries no swords but cannot be defeated. Ha-in looked at him. For a long time, the sun filtered through the leaves of the trees and fell in patches on her face. Then she quietly said one sentence, that she believed him. Not his calculations, not his numbers, him. Taewon was silent, because there were no words to answer that. He stood up, he bowed, he turned toward the exit. She called out to him. She asked if he would return. Taewon turned back. He said he would return, and that next time, he would bring her not papers, but tea from Cheongju, which she surely hadn't tried. Ha-in smiled slightly, the second smile in all the time he'd known her. Taewon returned to Myeongjin. Everyone was waiting for him at the pier. Han, Ara, Eugene, Mugil, little Meaty, who had grown half a head taller in a year and was running around the warehouse bossing the loaders around so that they obeyed. Taewon stepped down from the cart. He looked at them, at the warehouse with the sign, at the morning heron by the pier with new sails soaked in Eugene's concoction, at the route board visible through the office window. A year ago, he had woken up in a stranger's body, without money, without friends, without hope. Now he had an alliance. People, a network of 3 warehouses, a ship, a pier, a bank in the making, an alchemical production facility, and 17 sheets of paper that could change the history of an entire kingdom. Ada handed him a book, the monthly report. He opened it. He read it. Turnover for the last month exceeded 6,000 ryongs. The union's receipts were accepted in 5 cities. 27 merchants stored goods in warehouses. Eugene was producing goods worth 400 ryangs a month. Khan was preparing to buy a second ship. Caravans crossed the bridge into the gorge every week. A system of couriers connected Myeongjin with Cheongju and Seho. Taewon closed the book. He looked at Ada and said it was time to launch a bank. A real one, with promissory notes, with loans, with interest. Ada looked at him, then at her notebook, then back at him. She asked if she could handle it. Taewon replied that if anyone on this continent could handle it, it was her. Ada blushed. She turned away. She pressed the notebook to her chest and said quietly that her father would be proud. Taewon said nothing, because he knew that at that moment, she wasn't just talking about her father. Taewon bought his father's secretary desk through a front man who was an antique dealer and found 17 forged grain receipts signed by First Minister Kim Seong-jun for a total 312,000 ryang. The full scheme of embezzlement, in which all 3 rival houses were involved, was exposed. Taewon made 3 copies and distributed them to Han, Baegonsu, and Ha-in. The princess warned that the documents must not be presented until the union became strong enough. Taewon announced the launch of the bank. 6 years have passed since the day Taewon woke up in a stranger's body on the floor of a ransacked office. He is 21. The Seoul Trade Union has become something the continent of Haegyong has never seen before. 9 warehouses stretching from the coast to the northern foothills, 5 ships flying the Seoul flag, 2 river docks, a union bank with branches in 4 cities, bills of exchange accepted everywhere, an insurance fund used by 300 merchants, a network of couriers covering the entire continent and providing price information 3 days ahead of any competitor. 2 million people in the 3 kingdoms received grain through the union's logistics. Taewon did not trade in grain, he traded in trust. Just as he had once promised. A paper bearing Seo's signature was worth more than a gold ryang because behind it stood a reputation built over 7 years and never once broken. The House of Pak went bankrupt in its 5th year. Quietly, without fanfare, without scandal. Just one morning, their ships were sitting in the port of Myeongjin, and no one wanted to insure their cargo. The Union's insurance fund was the only one on the continent, and it turned down the House of Pak, not out of revenge, out of calculation. Pak's ships were old, the crews were unreliable, the routes were unprofitable, the risk was too high. The fund couldn't cover losses for the sake of a single client. Arithmetic, pure arithmetic, but arithmetic that destroyed a trading house with a 200-year history. Park Jung-ho came to see Taewon on a winter day. Snow lay on the roofs of Myeongjin. A wind blew in from the sea. It was cold. The old man entered the Union's office. He had aged 20 years over the past 5, no gold rings on his fingers, in a plain coat with a patch on the elbow. He sat down across from him. He was silent for a long time, hands on his knees, head bowed. Then he quietly asked for a job, any job, a clerk, a porter, a guard, anything. Taewon looked at him, at the man who had been his father's best friend for 20 years, who used to come over for holidays, who gave the boy sweets, and who was the first to sign the papers declaring the Soh house bankrupt, who knew what he was signing, knew that his friend had learned the truth, and knew that the signature meant death. Taewon felt no anger. He waited to feel something. He had been preparing, for years, and now the moment had come. But there was no anger, there was silence. That very silence, from the operating room, when the procedure is over, when the numbers on the screen are green, when you can breathe out. He gave Park Jung-ho a job as a warehouse clerk in Myeongjin, 2 ryong a month, a position held 10 years ago by the youngest employee at the House of Soh. Park Jung-ho bowed to the floor, forehead to the wood. He stood up. He left. The door closed. Taewon sat and stared at the closed door. Then he said quietly into the empty room, "Dad, the debt is settled." The Che house gave in on the 4th year. Che Bong-hwan was smarter than Park. He saw which way the wind was blowing sooner. He sold the 2 remaining berths to the Union at a fair price. He didn't haggle. He didn't threaten. He just came and signed. He said the boy had won. Taewon replied that no one had won. Everyone got what they deserved. Bong-hwan smirked. He said it was the cruelest thing he'd ever heard, because it was the truth. He hadn't gone bankrupt. He became a small-time transporter on the river he once owned. Taewon left him a contract for 2 routes, not out of pity. Bong-hwan knew the river better than anyone, and his boats were fast. The Yoon family held out longer. The salt mines of Haedan aren't ships or docks. Everyone needs salt, always. But Taewon didn't go to war with salt. He went to war with the monopoly. In the 3rd year, he set Yujin a task, to find a way to evaporate salt from seawater more cheaply than extracting it from the mines. Yujin argued for 2 months. She said it was impossible, that evaporation required a huge amount of fuel, that it was economic nonsense. Taewon listened. He nodded, and he waited. In the 3rd month, Eugene came to the office at 3 in the morning. She woke him up. She threw a vial of white powder on the table, an alchemical catalyst. Add it to seawater, and the evaporation rate increases 6-fold. Fuel consumption drops by 2/3. The cost of producing salt from seawater becomes lower than mining it from salt mines. In any coastal city. Eugene stood over him, flushed with excitement, with ink on her forehead, and said she hated him for being right. Taewon looked at the powder, then at her. Then he said it was patent number 2. Eugene said that if he started talking again about pieces of paper that cost as much as a sack of salt, she would personally drown him in that very salt. The House of Yoon lost its pricing power in a single season. When coastal cities began evaporating their own salt under a union license, the mines ceased to be the sole source. The price fell, not catastrophically, by 30%, but enough for the monopoly to turn into just a business. The head of House Yoon came to Taewon cursing. He ranted for an hour. He threatened. He promised to set all of Haedan's officials on him. Taewon listened, silently. Then he laid out his terms. House Yoon keeps the kopi, sells them at market prices. In return, the union includes him in the insurance pool and grants access to bank loans. Yoon ranted for another 2 hours. Then he signed. In the 4th year, Taewon presented the papers, not publicly, not through the courts, through Ha-in, who by that time had already left the convent 3 years earlier, quietly, without fanfare. She simply stopped being a nun one day and began appearing at court, first as a guest, then as an advisor, then as someone people listened to. She didn't scheme, she didn't plot. She did what Taewon had taught her. She listened, she remembered. She found people who were dissatisfied, and she offered them not a rebellion but an alternative. An official whose salary hadn't risen in 30 years received, through the union, a contract to audit warehouses. An officer who had been passed over for a promotion received, through the union, a contract to guard caravans. Every small act, every small decision, a web of gratitude and dependence that no one noticed until it was too late. On the day Hyun placed 17 receipts on the Council of Ministers' table, 12 people sat beside her who were indebted to her, not with money, with opportunities. Kim Sung-joon sat at the same table. He turned pale when he saw the first receipt. He blushed when he saw the 7th. At the 12th, he tried to stand up. They sat him back down. At the 17th, he said it was a forgery. His voice broke. Hyun silently placed the originals from the Treasury archives next to it, which Taewon had obtained through Moon Ji-hwan, the very same chief of the Chancellery to whom a 14-year-old boy had once voluntarily brought the books. In 6 years, Moon Ji-hwan had risen to become the head of the Royal Audit Office. Taewon hadn't asked him to do this. Taewon simply created an accounting standard that Moon implemented throughout the kingdom. And when Moon requested access to the Treasury archives for verification, Taewon knew the originals would be found. They matched, signature to signature, seal to seal, amount to amount. 312,000 ryong. Kim Sung-joon was arrested that same evening. He walked between 2 guards down the palace corridor and said nothing. Taewon wasn't present during the arrest. He was sitting in his office in Myeongjin, reading the monthly report. Ara brought tea. Yoojin popped in to ask if he needed anything. Taewon said no. He drank tea and read the figures. The figures were good. In the 5th year, Park Jung-ho, who worked as a clerk in the warehouse, uncovered a conspiracy. A group of former merchants from the Park House was attempting to forge union promissory notes. Park Jung-ho overheard a conversation at the market. He recognized one of the conspirators, his former manager. He came to Taewon that evening, quietly, no conditions, no requests for a reward. He simply told him. Taewon looked at him, the man who 6 years ago had signed his father's ruin, who had worked as a clerk for 2 ryong for 3 years, who was now defending the union from those who had once been his own people. Taewon thanked him. Park Jung-ho nodded. He stood up, stopped at the door, turned around, said that So In-gyu was the best man he had ever known, and that he regretted it every day. Taewon was silent. Park Jung-ho left. The door closed quietly. In the 6th year, Yoojin received a patent for an antiseptic, the first patent in the history of Haegyeong. Taewon had invented the concept of a patent a year earlier, a document signed by the Royal Chancellery granting the exclusive right to manufacture a specific compound for 10 years. When Hyun presented the idea to the council, 3 ministers asked why it was needed. Taewon wrote a 4-page explanation for Hyun. If an alchemist knows his formula will be stolen, he will not invent. If he does not invent, the kingdom will not receive medicines, preservatives, and dyes. A patent is not a privilege, it is the crown's investment in the future. The council agreed. Eugene held the sealed document in both hands. She stood in the middle of the laboratory. She was silent. Then she said quietly that it was just a piece of paper. Taewon replied that it was a piece of paper worth a sack of salt. Eugene laughed, loudly, tilting her head back. For the first time in 6 years, she laughed without bitterness or venom, purely, like a child. Taewon stood and watched her, thinking that for the sake of that laugh, it was worth inventing an entire legal system. That same year, someone tried to poison Taewon. A final blow from the shadows. Poison on documents that arrived from the office marked urgent. An envelope, an ordinary one. The paper inside was soaked in a substance that absorbs through the skin. Eugene was sitting in the office when Taewon opened the envelope. She looked up. She sniffed. Her face changed in a split second. She rushed across the room toward him, grabbed his hand, snatched the paper from his fingers, brought it to her nose, and threw it out the window. Then she grabbed his hands and examined them. The skin was slightly reddened at the tips of his fingers. She washed them with the solution that was always on her desk. Then she yelled at him for 20 minutes, that he was an idiot, that he opened envelopes without gloves, that she hadn't spent 6 years brewing his medicine just so he could die from poison on a piece of paper, that if he ever touched anything from the office again without her checking it, she would personally poison his tea and have peace of mind. Taewon stood there and listened, and smiled, because behind the shouting was something Eugene never put into words. She cared. She feared for him. Always. In the 7th year, King Hadan died, quietly, in his sleep, painlessly, without an heir. The court split. 3 factions. General Ohm demanded military rule. A group of old ministers wanted a distant relative from the southern province. The merchant houses waited, hoping that the chaos would allow them to redraw the map of influence. Everyone expected war. Tavan arrived in Wangjian, alone, without guards. Saren followed him 10 paces behind, as always, but he told her to wait outside. He entered the palace, not as a merchant, not as a supplicant, as a man whose union fed 2 million people, whose promissory notes had replaced gold, whose ships carried grain to every garrison. He stood before the council, 21 years old, simple, dark-colored clothing, no weapons, no jewelry, only the Union of So's seal on his belt, and he proposed a candidate, Zheng Ha-in, the king's half-sister, the only living heir of royal blood. General O stood up. He asked why a merchant was deciding who would sit on the throne. Taewan looked at him. He replied that he wasn't deciding, he was proposing. The council decides. But let the council take one detail into account. The contract to supply grain to the army expires in 30 days. 4 garrisons on the northern border, 12,000 soldiers. Each eats 3 times a day. The Union delivers the grain. If the contract isn't renewed, the soldiers will go hungry in a month. And Taewan will not renew the contract until he is certain that the new ruler will not follow in Kim Sung-jun's footsteps. Silence. General Ohm sat down, slowly. The council's oldest member, Minister An, stood up. He looked at Taewan, then at the others. He said that Princess Zheng Ha-in was the only legitimate candidate by blood and by right, and that he supported her. The second stood up, the third, the fifth, the eighth. General Ohm stood up last. The coronation took place in the throne room of Wangjiang, lit by 1,000 candles, gold, mahogany, silk banners. Ha-in walked down the hall in a white dress with a gold trim, pale, dark eyes, straight back. She looked straight ahead, not down, not to the side, straight ahead. For the first time in all the years Tavan had known her, she sat on the throne. The hall dropped to its knees. Tavan stood in the crowd, not on the platform, not next to the throne, among the merchants and officials and ordinary townspeople, on his knees like everyone else. But when he stood up, his eyes met hers, for a second, and that second was enough. After the ceremony, he was offered the crown, quietly, through an intermediary. General Ohm relayed through an aide that the queen needed a husband, that a merchant who fed 2 million people could become a king who fed everyone. Tavan said no, without hesitation, because he knew the difference between a scepter and a contract. A scepter is given, a contract is signed. What is given can be taken away, what is signed remains. He came to Hain that evening, to the throne room, empty. The candles were nearly burned out, shadows on the walls. She sat on the throne, alone, a small figure in the vast hall. The crown on her head seemed too heavy for her slender neck. She heard his footsteps. She did not turn. He approached, stood before her, took out a scroll, placed it on the armrest of the throne, the contract between the Union and the Crown, a 12-page document he had been writing for 3 months, every clause carefully crafted, every word in its place. The Union was becoming an official economic institution of the kingdom, independent of the court, with the right to issue promissory notes, with the right to provide insurance, with the right to trade in any kingdom of Haegyeon. In return, the Union undertook to feed the population at fixed prices in the event of famine, to build and maintain roads, to maintain a network of couriers for the royal mail, to ensure a standard of accounting for all trading houses, and to report to the crown annually. Hain read, for a long time, page after page. Tevin stood and waited. Shadows moved across the walls. The candles crackled. She finished reading. She looked up. Tevin took a ring out of his pocket. Small, silver, no stones, with a single decoration, the So House seal. The very seal he had carved himself 7 years ago on a fragment of a silver coin because the real house seal had been taken by creditors. He took her hand, slipped the ring onto her finger. Hain didn't move. She looked at the ring, at the silver seal on the thin band, then at him, and for the first time in 7 years, she cried. Not quietly, for real. Tears streamed down her cheeks and fell onto the white fabric of her dress. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't look away. She cried and looked at him, and in her eyes was everything they had never said to each other. Taewan stood before her. He was silent, because there are things for which no words exist in any language, in any world. Late at night, He climbed onto the roof of the Union Bank in Wanjan, alone. A stone platform, a parapet, the wind from the sea, cold, salty. He stood and looked at the city lights, thousands of lights, torches on the walls, lamps in the windows, lanterns on the ships at the docks, the harbor below, the water of the bay, dark, with reflections. He looked at the water, and for a second he saw, not the reflections of the lights, something else. Headlights, yellow light, two streaks disappearing into the dark water. The Han River, the overpass, night, rain. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up. His eyes were closing. His hands on the wheel were weakening. His last thought. He hadn't closed his copper futures position. The car crashed through the guardrail. A second of weightlessness, the impact of the water, darkness, and then light, different, dim, a damp ceiling with wooden beams, a stranger's body, a stranger's name, a stranger's world. Taewon blinked. The reflection vanished. The headlights dissolved into the ripples. Only the harbor lights and the stars remained. He stood on the roof and smiled, quietly, to himself. Daniel So died in the cold waters of the Hangang at the age of 34 without closing his futures position. So Taewon stood on the roof of the bank he had built himself at the age of 21, with all positions closed, with every position closed. He turned and walked down the stairs, stone steps beneath his feet, warmth from the open door below, the smell of fried fish and rice, laughter, voices. Everyone was seated at a long table in the bank's large hall. Han Real, 37 years old, a weathered face, a scar across his eyebrow. He commands 5 ships. He doesn't drink anymore. He's no longer afraid of losing people, because her people are now protected by the system built by the boy she fell in love with when he was 14 and whom she waited 7 years for. Oh, Eugene, 29 years old, still thin, still has ink on her fingers. She complained that the rice was too salty and that the cook was a barbarian and that she could cook it better herself. 32 patents, a lab with 12 employees, and a quiet pride she hid behind her sarcasm. Sun Ara, 23 years old, redhead, with freckles, chief treasurer of the union. She was calculating something in a notebook even during dinner. Her younger sister Miri sat next to her, 14 years old. She was drawing a 3-masted ship on a napkin with the word Miri written on the side. Jeon Ha-in, 26 years old, in a simple dress without a crown. She came from the palace after changing clothes. Quiet, with a silver ring on her finger. Yuna Everett, 32 years old, copper-colored skin, silver hair, laughed louder than anyone else. Her spice caravan from the western continent was now traveling along the first ever intercontinental trade corridor. Park Sarin, 31 years old, tall, slender, silent, sat by the door with her back to the wall and her face toward the windows, her hands in plain sight. 7 years by Taevon's side and not a single order to kill. The habit of sleeping by his door remained. The habit of checking every room before he entered remained. But something had changed. She smiled. Rarely. Just a little. With one corner of her mouth. But she smiled. Pei Gonsu, 67 years old. Old. Gray-haired. With wrinkles that had grown deeper. He managed 9 warehouses and complained that young people couldn't count. Che Mu-gil, 47 years old. He ate for 3. He commanded the security forces of the entire Union. His men were stationed in every city. Quiet, inconspicuous, reliable. Yuna laughed. No one remembered exactly what at. The laughter had started with something specific and now existed apart from its cause. Hain looked at him and smiled, quietly, with just her eyes, the way people smile who have seen you in your worst days and decided to stay. Saren, standing by the door, tilted her head slightly. She never sat down at the table first and never took her hand far from the hilt, even here, even now, when enemies were dead or ruined, and more often both. A habit of a body that had spent too long protecting others' lives to learn how to protect its own. Outside the bank windows, the lights of Wangjian were burning. The city descended toward the water in terraces of rooftops, and in every window there was a light, a number in someone's ledger, a debt, and a hope. Ships rocked at the docks, the very ones that 3 years ago had been blueprints that no one believed in, except for the boy who had sketched crooked numbers next to crooked masts. The wind carried the scent of salt and fried fish, and somewhere beneath that scent, barely perceptible, was the smell of money, resin, hemp, sealing wax, ink, a scent he had learned to love because it was the scent of trust, transformed into things one could touch. Somewhere far away, in the port of Mangina, in a warehouse that 7 years ago had been a ruin with a collapsed roof and rats in the corners, stood an old dark wood secretary desk, with an empty false bottom, now empty. The papers that lay there beneath a layer of dust and someone else's calculations had changed the kingdom, not with thunder, not with war, but quietly, line by line, receipt by receipt, until one day it turned out that one could neither buy grain, nor equip a ship, nor borrow money until spring, without going through the name that the boy bore not by blood. And the boy who found them sat at the table among his people. He ate rice. He listened as Eugene scolded the cook for the oversalted soup, for the tough meat, for everything at once. And the cook snapped back, and it wasn't a quarrel, but a family ritual, without which the meal would have seemed bland. He watched as Mary showed Hayne her drawing, poking her finger at each mast, and explaining why this particular one would be the main mast, though she didn't know the word for it, and was making it up as she went along. He kept a promissory note in his pocket for a grain shipment during the spring navigation season. It needed to be signed tomorrow, and that signature was worth more than his father's entire house had once been, in that life where he had a father. He had already checked the figures 3 times. They added up. They always added up now, and only one position remained open, somewhere in another world, in another life. A long position in copper futures, which he had opened on Tuesday and hadn't managed to close because on Wednesday there was water. The cold water of the Hangang, the lights of the bridge blurring overhead, and the last thought, absurd, bookkeeping-like, unworthy of a final thought. The margin call will come on Friday, and I won't be there. And he wasn't there, neither on Friday nor afterward. Sometimes, very rarely, he wondered what had become of that position. Had the broker closed it? Does anyone even remember that there was such a man who left behind an open trade and not a single unfinished conversation worth finishing? Most likely not. That life had come to nothing without him, and here, all positions had been closed, all debts were paid off, all the books were balanced, hand to hand, line by line, down to the last copper coin. Miri tugged at his sleeve, demanding he say aloud, in front of everyone, that the promise about the ship was real. He said it was real, that the ship would be named Miri, and that a coat of arms would be carved on the bow, and she could choose which way the bird would face. Tivan entered the hall. Eugene immediately pointed out that he wasn't wearing a hat again, that it was windy on the roof, and that she wouldn't treat him for a cold for the 4th time this year. Otto laughed. Hans smiled slightly. Miri jumped up and showed him the drawing. A ship, 3 masts, a flag with the So crest, and an inscription on the side. She asked if the next Union ship could be named after her. Tivan looked at the drawing, at the crooked masts and slanted sails drawn by the hand of a 14-year-old girl. Then at everyone at the table, at the faces of the people who had become his family, in a world where he was a stranger, in a body that wasn't his, with a name he hadn't earned by right, but he had earned it, with every voyage, every receipt, every sack of grain, every bridge, every patent, every sleepless night spent poring over numbers. He thought that the father and mother of this body would forgive him, not because he had avenged them, but because the surname So now meant what they had always wanted, not wealth, not power, trust. He sat down at the table, picked up his chopsticks, reached for the rice, and said they would name the ship Miri. The girl jumped up, hugged him so tightly he nearly knocked over his cup of tea. Eugene shouted, "Careful!" Ara caught the cup. Hans shook her head. Una laughed. Hayne looked at him and smiled, quietly, with just her eyes. Saren, standing by the door, tilted her head slightly. Outside the bank windows, the lights of Wangjan were burning. Ships rocked at the docks. The wind carried the scent of salt and fried fish. Somewhere far away, in the port of Myeongjin, in a warehouse that had been a ruin 7 years ago, stood an old, dark wood secretary desk with an empty false bottom. The papers inside it had changed the kingdom, and the boy who found them sat at the table among his people. He ate rice. He listened as Eugene scolded the cook. He watched as Miri showed Ha-in her drawing. He kept in his pocket a promissory note for a grain shipment during the spring navigation season, which needed to be signed tomorrow, and he thought that the copper futures position had remained open, somewhere, in another world, in another life, one that had ended in the cold waters of the Hanggang. But here, all positions had been closed, all debts paid off, all books balanced, and that was enough.